and get going. And so anyway, as I mentioned before, Scott's got a presentation that I think is pretty comprehensive of what's on the agenda. It's a little bit out of order than what I originally posted. Hillary just texted me. She's in the midst of a COVID crisis, so we may or may not join us. But we'll certainly update her. But in any event, what I was
and Kurt,
go ahead.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, I got a hard stop at 12:30, so I'm here for an hour and a half. But then I got another meeting.
And this account has to be used at 1 anyway, so.
Yep. And so what I was hoping we could do is wrap by somewhere between 12 and 12:30. Is if we get into too much, what I'd prefer to do is keep the meeting shorter and take any items that we haven't addressed and hold them over for the next meeting. So that we can have some placeholders and some action items for getting our next meeting going. I know Scott's very anxious to really get going on this watershed permit. I think he's done a lot of work to pull most of what we need to get done together for that type of filing. And, he can talk more about schedule in a minute, but I think if we start to meet at least, monthly, if not bi-weekly, we can start to chomp through this stuff. And maybe, Scott, what would you think in terms of, ultimate deadline for getting a permit done?
Well, I think one of the things on the agenda, and maybe Hillary can help us if she joins, is the update on the work at the transfer station. I think I saw an email that just indicated GHD just got under contract in the last week or two. I did do a detailed kickoff meeting with Hillary and the contractors, I'm guessing more than a month ago now. So I think they were at least thinking about starting then. But I think to file the draft plan, that work's going to be critical. So to answer your question, I think we need to hear from GHD once they get going as to what they think their time frame will be. But I certainly think my end of it, I think there's a few items that are going to come up today where I really need some input from the town. So I'm a little bit of that's I think I'm going to put back at you, Kurt, and the town in terms of how we make some decisions. For example, on the shellfish items that you and I have talked a little bit about. We can cover that maybe as we get there. But I'm pretty flexible. I mean, I've started drafting the plan. I'm formatting it so it's kind of ready to go. I just got to fill in the blanks, if you will. We got to make some decisions on ultimately what goes in the plan. I do have a slide today that updates the so-called calculator, which is sort of the numerics on the plan. And so we can look at that and see where we're at and so forth. So,
okay.
Sorry, that's kind of a long answer, but.
Yeah, no, that's fine. John, are you unmuted, John?
John who, me?
Yeah, you, John.
Yes.
Did you have any interest other than I know Scott has some information to present on Mayo Creek. Did you have any interest in anything else, or would it be time efficient for you if Scott?
I'm here to 12. I'm counting on being here to 12:30. Obviously, what I think where Mayo Creek is that I would like some guidance on how that fits into the project and how likely it is that it stays fit into the project, because that will determine our strategy to move forward or not, or how we move forward.
Okay. Well then, Scott, why don't you just start it and just dive in?
Sure. Okay, well, I'll start with Mayo Creek, John. And I sent you a summary of my my calculations and whatnot, which I'll run through with you today. But what I did was, because we don't really have detailed groundwater mapping in this area, I just delineated a surface watershed based upon the topography, which is an approximation, and I think a reasonably good approximation of the groundwater drainage area. And then what I did is I worked with the Cape Cod Commission on sort of digitizing information here and coming up with some land use, nitrogen loading, etc. So this is just the watershed area on the topo map. Here's the same area with the aerial. I know you guys are very familiar with this, although one thing I want to come back to later, as you can see, I think you can see my cursor moving around, hopefully.
Yeah.
So this area down here, there is a groundwater discharge permit located right in this area where my cursor is. And we're not really sure whether that's in the drainage area or not. And might be a significant factor. So that might be something we can talk more about detail later to fine tune this thing.
That's the one for the trailer park, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it does. I do have a map of it as part of this presentation, and I can show. We'll get to. And yeah, I think at some point, John, if we do want to include it in the plan, which I certainly do, I think it's a good idea. That might be a variable that we could try to nail down. So I got a picture coming up there. But in any case, here's the calculation I did, and I'll just walk you through this very quickly with the high points. What I tried to do here, as I indicated in the brief memo I sent, is utilize the existing information to come up with the best estimate. It's not perfect. It's not intended to be perfect, but we do have some pretty good information, I think. So starting at the top here, we do have a flow rate, which was in the Woods Hole group report that they prepared for the town. I did have a conference call with them about this, and they think they got some of this information from the USGS study that was done in the region, although the person who did this part of the report is no longer with Woods Hole Group. So we were unable to really verify the details of that. But in any case, there is either a modeled or a measured flow rate of 0.51 cubic feet per second. This is at the outlet of the current outlet for Mayo Creek. There's also been some good work done by the Center for Coastal Studies, and I did talk to Amy Costa. She shared her data with me, and I verified that with her. And I think that's over about a 2-year period. The average concentration is about 1.9 milligrams per liter of nitrogen coming out of there. So basically, multiplying the flow rate times the concentration gives me an existing load, 856 kilograms per year. That's, I think, the best estimate, or my best estimate, of what's likely discharging from that system currently. Now, I will note that that is a surface discharge. There's likely to be some groundwater that underflows the tide gate and the duckbill, I guess it's called. And I don't have any information on that yet. So it may be a number slightly higher than this as well, if we include the groundwater discharge.
Hey, Scott, I don't want to stop you too much there, but I did compare with the, I think it's the MEP report of the current load from Duck Creek.
Yep. Duck Creek or Mayo Creek?
Well, I think it's both.
Okay.
But just to, because
Yeah.
they don't break it out.
Right.
It was around 2,000 kilograms per year total.
Okay.
So,
Yep.
That seems like a pretty good number.
Okay.
It might be, somewhat underestimated, but,
Yeah.
In context, probably half and half is reasonable.
Sure. Okay. So this middle section is some of the data that I got from the Cape Cod Commission, who, as you all remember, is cooperating on this project and helping us. We utilized the watershed MVP tool or model to try to compute what's in this area with respect to, and some of that data is down here below as well. Number of septic systems. These numbers actually, the numbers in this part of the table actually come directly from the MVP analysis. You can see that the biggest contributor are the septic systems in that watershed. There's also some fertilizer load, stormwater load. Probably the biggest unknown is, for me at least, is this number here, the 189. What I did is I took the area of the wetland, which was measured at 47 acres up here, and multiplied times the loading factor that MEP uses for direct precip to surface waters. Now, I recognize this is not surface water, but it's close to surface water. So that's a number that probably needs to be looked at more closely in the future. In any case, totaling those, the numbers actually came out pretty interesting. If I total these loads here, again, the biggest one being septic, and then probably the second biggest one being this direct precip, because there is a fair amount of nitrogen precipitation, as you may remember. That comes up with a watershed load of about 900 kilograms, and that compares pretty favorably with what's been measured leaving the system. So that made me feel like at least I'm in the right ballpark here, right, order of magnitude. If I use those numbers, what that's telling me is currently the system might be mitigating or attenuating about 5% of the nitrogen, or 43 kilograms per year, the difference between those two numbers. And my way of thinking that is not unreasonable in that we're all in agreement. I think that this is an impaired former wetland. I guess it's still some sort of wetland, but it's probably not functioning ideally. So the next thing I did is I applied the 40% estimated so-called default number, attenuation number from the MEP studies. And that would give us this number of 359 kilograms per year. So that the 359 is 40% of the this watershed load right here. And then if I take out what we're assuming is currently being attenuated, the 43, that leaves us with 317 kilograms per year as an estimate of what we might get by restoring a salt marsh system there. As I said in the memo, I'm not suggesting this is an exhaustive study. I think it's, as far as I know, the best estimate based upon the information that we have available today. There are some possibilities that this number could go up. We might get better than 40% attenuation, but that's the only number that I'm aware of that's out there, at least published. I know it's in some DEP reports as well. So that's pretty much how I calculated the existing nitrogen load and the estimated reduction. And maybe I'll just pause there for a minute and see if anybody has any questions on what I've done.
Anybody
well-
else? Yeah, I mean,
My-
the only, Go ahead,
My
John.
question for planning purposes is if this number of 359
Yep.
goes to zero, what is the consequences for the project? And I'm to put some value on the Mayo Creek restoration. And hopefully at some time, I'd like to see a dollar value.
Dollar value on what it would cost to do the project, John?
Well, what is the dollar value of the Mayo Creek restoration to the wastewater project?
Okay, well that's a good question. I was going to ask you if Woods Hole Group had provided any cost estimates, but actually you're right. The other way we could do this is take the high number that's used as part of 208 for wastewater, for conventional wastewater, is up to around $1,000 a kilogram. So you could just, the simple way to do it would be to say it's probably worth somewhere on the order of $300,000 a year, right? If you use that number in terms of a comparison. I know in Barnstable, as part of the other project I'm involved in, that's the number we're using for comparison to some of our wetland restoration work that I actually have a few slides on that I want to show you as an update. So that's one way to look at it. You could take the 359 or the 317 and multiply it times a comparative sewering cost number. And I don't know if there is a number specific to Wellfleet, and if there is, we ought to use it in terms of what prior contractors estimated for construction and operation of a centralized system. Again,
There is a number in our final report. It's on the Mayo Creek webpage. It was 3 million plus or minus.
Okay.
And that came from Fuss and O'Neill.
All right. Well, that might be the better number to use, John, as a comparison.
right, but to your point, Scott, the avoided cost is more like what a sewer system would cost, and that's about $1,000 a kilogram.
Well, that's the number as a, probably higher end estimate for Cape Cod wide, considering lower density areas. Wellfleet might be a little more cost effective because the town center is a little more dense. But I think John, if you put your fingers on some actual numbers for prior studies, that might be the better way to go. But there probably is a way to evaluate this, John. It's a good point. Good question. And I'm happy to work with you on that.
Okay.
Why don't I keep going? Because I do have a couple things that I'm going to throw out here. This is the close-up of the lower watershed, and I'll use my pointer. This is actually a map from Mass GIS. And right here, you can see that little dot. That is their digitized location of the groundwater discharge. And I think you're right, it's associated with this, I don't know if it's referred to as a trailer park or not, this high density development. And from the mapping that I have available, I'm not sure whether it's in or out of the drainage area to Mayo Creek. One way we could determine this is if this is a groundwater discharge permit issued by DEP, there should be a so-called hydrogeologic report that was prepared as part of that permit. I don't know when that wastewater plant was built, but if somebody in town, and Hillary might be a point person to help us find this, I know she's really busy. If there is a groundwater discharge permit and hydrogeologic report, that should determine whether or not the flow is towards Mayo Creek or towards more southerly towards the harbor. And I think that's an important variable here in this analysis.
I may have some documents, so I'll see what's in my old file and see if that particular question is answered.
Very good.
Don't guarantee it, but I'll look.
Okay, thank you. And then I just wanted to touch on this again. We talked about this the last time, but I've done some further thinking, and I just want to update you on the work in Barnstable, which I think is relevant. This is a map from the Woods Hole Group report where they identified these so-called channels. And the report discusses using or promoting these channels for drainage, because I understand in this project, like many other wetland restoration projects, one of the issues is water levels in the neighborhood. And you want to be careful. It's kind of like a balance between enough water to establish the wetland, but also not too much water to flood septic systems and homes and properties. So I believe that this part of the report is suggesting that there might be some use of these channels to handle, as it says in the caption of the figure, improved drainage. And that got me thinking about what we're doing in Barnstable. And you may recall I mentioned this before. We have a project in Barnstable, Marston's Mills specifically, which is a large wetland restoration project, 150 acres, that's really getting some momentum, a lot of interest. We've filed it with the state for our preliminary work with Alex Hackman and other groups. And the project involves a number of components, including, this is primarily cranberry bogs now, but there's an area up in the northern corner here where we have these ditches, which I'm going to suggest is somewhat analogous maybe to the ditches in the Mayo Creek situation. And we're thinking about, well, actually, we've actually built them. I'll show you a picture. We've been contemplating using those ditches to construct some of these so-called bioreactors using wood chips. So there's more and more data suggesting that these things are pretty efficient at treating nitrogen. This is just a picture of one of the cranberry bog ditches that I may have shown you before. This is more of a close-up of where we have been planning to install. This is a field prototype project. And this is, again, the conceptual design on the upper right here. Take one of these ditches, we actually decided on a 30-foot section with wood chips with monitoring wells in it, upstream, downstream, so that we can try to actually determine efficiency of this thing. I might just add, this project has about 25 scientists working on its design, including about 8 or 10 from 4 EPA offices as far west as Ada, Oklahoma, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Nature Conservancy. There's a lot of thinking going into this. And we were all out there this past Tuesday, many of us, or about 20 of us out there, and we installed it. And this is what it's starting to look like. This is the monitoring wells in the ditch, and on the right, you can see the backfilled area with the wood chips. And monitoring is going to start next week. So we're pretty excited about this. And I guess one of the thoughts for Mayo Creek is that the wood chip design here, and I'll just go back to this figure. One of the goals, according to these researchers, this guy Robertson, who's published a lot of information, considered, I guess, one of the grandfathers on this whole wood chip technology. If I can just refer you to this graphic here again, this is the wood chip design. We're looking at a cross section, intermediate between an upland area and a stream. And you can see that there's a big K here versus a small k. K stands for permeability. And what they're suggesting here is that when you install this wood chip bioreactor, you make it very permeable compared to the native sand, which is what we think we've done in Barnstable. And what that does is it wicks the water in it and through it. So if you're familiar with the term French drain, which by the way has nothing to do with the country of France, but it has to do with a gentleman who grew up in Concord, Massachusetts. That's another story. French drain was invented for exactly this reason, to put a high permeable deposit in the ground to wick groundwater through it to a stream. The only difference here is we're using wood chips instead of stone. The wood chips have a much higher permeability, so they do affect drainage, as is suggested in the Wood Soil Group report. But the advantage is they also remove a lot of nitrogen, as much as 80 or 90%. So I just wanted to put this out there as another idea, and I'm happy to talk about it offline with any or all of you if you want to pursue it further, think about it, because it strikes me that if you wanted to optimize the Mayo Creek project, we might be able to consider integrating this technology. And that's really all I wanted to say about it. I did mention this before, and I really wanted to just update you on the project in Barnstable. We hope to start getting data. The lab turnaround is going to be at least a month or more, but maybe later this fall we'll have some preliminary data on that. Everybody's pretty optimistic about the efficiency of it. So that's pretty much all I had on Mayo Creek, and maybe I'll just pause there. Let me go back and see if there are any questions on either Mayo Creek or the bioreactor. But John, I guess I'll just end by answering your first question. I do plan to put it in the plan as an item, as a proposed restoration, as long as the town's still supportive of it. And I think we can put a number out there like this 317 or 350 kilograms as an estimate, and try to prove it out through monitoring later on. So I'll stop there and see if there are questions or comments on Mayo Creek or the bioreactors.
Scott, that's good. My action now is to follow up, apart from looking at the septic system at the trailer park, is to follow up with Hillary and John Portnoy and see where we go from here. I've been waiting for a green light from this committee, and I'll take what you have said so far as a green light.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear there's going to be a benefit. These projects are hard to really, estimate with a lot of certainty, but I think there's going to be a measurable benefit, and seems to me it's worth we keep it in the plan.
Great, thank you.
My recommendation, sure.
John, the other thing that strikes me about it too is, and I'll be interested to hear sort of John Portnoy's and your reaction to whether using the wood chip bioreactor enhancement would be beneficial or whether it's desirable from your standpoint. But from the community standpoint, especially the trailer park, if the wood chips are actually wicking water and enhancing flow out of that basin, basically it's a swamp. The trailer park itself was put in that swamp land to begin with. I would imagine that would actually be helpful to them in terms of something that's pulling water out of those areas and moving it into the drainage channels.
Good point.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting technology that might have some application, if not in Mayo Creek, some other locations in Wellfleet. So we can keep talking about it. And the nice thing is we have this pilot project going on in Barnstable, so we can learn from that, and might be something worth considering doing as a pilot in Wellfleet at some point as well. All right, the next item, I'll keep moving here in the interest of time, is the enhanced INA septic systems that we've been talking about. And I just want to, again, update you on what's happening in Barnstable. This is a map of Schubel's Pond, which is in the Three Bays watershed. And again, this is a project joint between USGS, EPA, Nature Conservancy, and others. And what they've done so far is installed these monitoring wells. And they've also measured, actually, I'll go to the next slide. Well, actually, before I leave this one, you can see, I think that in this area, this is a neighborhood which is somewhat representative of, I think, downtown Wellfleet, because the density is probably on the order of between 4 and 8 homes per acre. Pretty dense, and this is all on-site septic. So the reason they selected the site is they felt it was an area they could measure not only the performance of the individual systems, like this nitro system we've been talking about, which of course has already been done at the test center at MMR. The idea here was to put somewhere in the order of 20 or 30 systems in this neighborhood, and then see if they can measure a cumulative nitrogen reduction benefit in both the groundwater and in the pond. And that's really the focus of the USGS and the EPA work. Again, here's the technology that we plan to use. You may remember, this is essentially a tank, a treatment tank, concrete tank that's installed between the septic tank and the leach field Title V system. And it's really a wood chip technology. Again, very similar to what I just showed you in the creek, and in this case, it's going into a concrete chamber. He also does use limestone and aeration to optimize the system. And as I think I mentioned to you at the last meeting, he's getting effluent numbers down around 5 milligrams per liter, which is a heck of a lot better than the average of a lot of the other INA systems, which is around 19 milligrams per liter. So we're pretty excited about that as a prospect. And the other thing I should mention, again, I don't think we've met since this happened, but I did mention this to Hillary. This technology has received, since the last time we met, has received pilot level approval from Mass DEP. So it is a technology that people can install now as a preliminarily approved system by Mass DEP. And that's why it's going in this area in Barnstable. And I want to talk with Hillary a little more at some point about the opportunity to try to use the system in Wellfleet as some demonstrations. What they need is about 50 systems in the ground and tested to take it from what's called pilot level approval to general use. And there's a lot of us who would like to see this happen as quickly as possible because we believe that this system is really going to make a huge difference. So that's the pilot project. Go ahead.
Yeah, Scott, just one question. And at 5 milligrams per liter, that's equivalent then to a sewage treatment facility.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, the data that he's getting that I've seen is in that. It's gone as low as 2 or 3 up to about 10. I didn't mention the permit that DEP has issued as an upper limit on the system is at 11 milligrams per liter, which to my knowledge is the lowest INA out there. Most of them are 19. And they usually put that number higher to make sure that they can meet it. Interestingly, a lot of the other systems that are rated at 19 are not making 19. And you can look at George Hoyfelder's data to look at that situation. So there's a lot of the other INAs are not really performing as I think people had hoped. But this one so far is producing data better than the permit number, which is at 11.
Scott, is that pilot?
Excuse me. What's the issue of efficiency for seasonal versus non-seasonal, and what is the maintenance issue for this particular system? It looks great, but I wonder about those two.
Yeah, good questions. What I've heard is that because this is a subsurface system, the temperature is a little bit insulated. But like a lot of these technologies, we have seasonal housing. It does take a little bit of time to get the critters up and running in the spring. John Smith is the inventor and scientist behind this thing, and he has addressed that in a number of public meetings and makes a pretty convincing case that the gear up is pretty quick, and that you might see some somewhat reduced efficiency at the beginning of the summer, but if you average it out through the summer, he's still pretty confident it's going to be below the 11 with the average. On the maintenance side, this one is pretty low maintenance. It does have power. It does have a blower like most of the systems. So as he says, if a hurricane, we lose our power for a few days, what happens is the system still will function because it's gravity flow. It's not a pumped system. It's gravity flow, but it does have the blower. So worst cases, it would go back and work like a Title V system. So there's no.
That sounds good to me.
It does. And the other exciting part of this is, there's obviously a port, not only a sampling port, but a so-called manhole. I guess we're going to start calling those person holes to access the media. And it's really easy to get in and replace. People ask, how long will the media last, the wood chips? best guess from what I've seen, again, Robertson's done a lot of the research up in Canada. It looks like it's 20, 30 years plus. So, but again, to remove the stuff with a vac truck and put in new wood chips is a pretty quick operation. So the maintenance part of it looks pretty good. And that's one of the reasons why we've been attracted to this technology.
Scott, have you do you know that that pilot program in Barnstable is going to be up and operational?
Well, there's 2 systems that have been permitted and are going into the ground as soon as they can get the contractors out there. I'm guessing over the next several weeks. They are planning, they have a grant application they filed with the state that they're waiting on. And I think they're supposed to hear by the end of the summer on that. And that would fund as many as 50 more systems, which would be 30 to 50 systems, I should say, which would get them quite a ways along if they get the grant. If they don't get the grant, the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition, which is a small nonprofit, actually has pledged, I think, $2 million of their own money to install about 20 of these systems on their own. And so the time, and so we're waiting on the grant. They're waiting on the grant. My guess is some of these will go in later this fall and winter, and the rest of them in the spring. I think the plan is to have everything operational by next summer. And then, you know, they're going to be, actually the monitoring wells are going in over the next couple of weeks. So the data, the baseline data is going to be collected probably, you know, later this summer, early fall. So my guess is we'll see performance data by next summer on this. And again, the goal is to get, DP requires at least, I think it's 55 or 60 systems for a 3-year period to take this from pilot to general approval. There's some indication that they might be willing to consider expediting that 3 years on approval. But again, there's no, even though this is only pilot approval, people can put it in the ground now. So that's kind of the timing on it. And
the increased cost from a normal Title V, you know,
cost.
Well, yeah, is as I recall when we talked about this before, it was like an additional 10 grand.
Well, you know, that's one of the things, that's the other thing that we hope to come out of this Barnstable study, because they're retrofitting. It kind of depends whether it's a retrofit or a new system. And if the retrofit requires a new leach field, then that's pretty expensive, but that's not really part of this treatment system. So you have to be careful how you allocate the costs out here. But I would say that you're right. Probably something on the order of an additional 10,000 is a good number to use, in my opinion, from what I've seen. But again, if somebody's going to dig up their whole system and replace it with a new leach field, it's going to be more than that, obviously. But I think the amount that you'd attribute to the nitrogen removal, which is really that central tank here, is probably about 10 grand. That's right.
Again, can I ask the question?
Of course.
Comparing this to a regular Title V, but the fact is, in many of our areas, we would want some sort of enhanced system. What's the comparison of this system to a standard AI system?
In terms of cost?
Yeah.
I think it's the 10,000 is a good number to use. So I don't know what an average Title V is costing to go into Wellfleet now. Maybe.
No,
that's
Scott,
not
he's
my
asking
point.
about IA costs.
Oh, other IA.
The other IA costs versus this one.
Right.
I think it's in the same cost range from my experience. The numbers are kind of all over the place, but I think that number seems to be pretty standard. Some of them, there's another system called Nitrex, which is also a wood chip system that also has great performance data, but it's a little more expensive. Maybe 15 grand extra. I think 10 to 20 is probably the range of extra cost for the nitrogen enhancement. I don't know how many there are now. There's like maybe 6 or 8 different technologies have been approved by Mass DEP as INA, but all of them, or virtually all of them, are rated at that 19 milligrams per liter. So I think, you know, short answer is I think it's in line with the other costs. It's not more expensive, might even be less expensive than the average.
I mean, I think that's an important selling point because these systems, from what I understand, produce better numbers and are a little more dependable than a standard IA system. And if we're trying to sell something to homeowners, we need to upgrade to an IA system. We have a better system that's not going to cost them any more than a standard IA system, I think that's an important selling point.
That's my understanding, and I think I've been sharing everything I've got with Hillary, and I know she's in a sensitive spot. She can't necessarily recommend one vendor over another, but I think that one of the goals here is for all of us to learn more about the questions you're asking here. There's only about, I don't know, less than 10 of these in now. So we need more data on performance and cost, which is what really, that's the goal of the Barnstable study.
Right.
So in addition to the performance data from Barnstable next year, even before that, we'll have some better numbers on costs. Because as all of us know, as homeowners or whatever, you really never know the cost until it's totally installed, right?
Right.
Plumber, contractor, electrician hand you the final bill, and sometimes it's a little different than the original estimate. So the real way to get costs, I think, is to build them rather than ask somebody for an estimate and look at the finished cost, which we'll have in Barnstable. And we'll have it on a variety of properties, which again, as I'm suggesting, is somewhat analogous to Wellfleet, because these lots are small, tight dimensionally, and that can cause issues with, especially with cost. So I think some of that's all going to be very well documented. Why don't I keep moving here?
Yeah, just one quick question, Scott.
Okay.
As part of the performance analysis, are they going to be doing anything with contaminants of emerging concern?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's been a big question, and that's the nice thing about having EPA as a partner is we get all of their laboratories nationally. Pretty amazing project. This project, by the way, has been selected as one of 2 sites in the United States for the so-called new translational science research program. Not sure exactly how we got selected, but we did. And because of that, we've got EPA labs, and they've already actually done some samples baseline on the emerging contaminants. So we're going to have those kind of analyses.
Cool.
That's a question that's being asked, as you know, Kurt, by people. So we want to be able to see that. So we'll have that data. All right, so the next item is, there's a lot of words on this slide. This violates all my rules about never show more than 20 words on a slide. But I want to advise you about this. I talked to Hillary about this. I am currently serving on a Mass DEP Title V Advisory Committee. And we've been working for a couple, 3 years. We've been on hold since March, like much of the rest of the planet, for the obvious reasons. But this committee's been meeting and looking at changes to Title V. We have a meeting coming up in early September, and the subject matter is going to be so-called nitrogen-sensitive areas. And what I've done here is I've copied some excerpts, and you can read these later in detail, or you can actually go to Title V and read the whole text. But there's a section in Title V that and some of you may know this, that have provisions, restrictions on the amount of wastewater you can put into an area based upon nitrogen loading. And this is called, starting with section 214, as you can see here, there are limitations. So it says no more than 440 gallons per acre. Now this is in areas, if you kind of scroll down here to the bottom here, this designation, these are in nitrogen sensitive areas. So what are nitrogen sensitive areas? And the answer to that question is right over here. It currently includes zone 2 areas to public supply wells. Okay, and then it also says nitrogen sensitive embayments, but notice here it says shall be mapped. Well, they haven't been yet by Mass DEP, so currently they do not regulate nitrogen sensitive embayments, which of course Wellfleet Harbor is. So there's no provisions to restrict nitrogen. People can put in a standard Title V, and they don't have to meet any nitrogen standards according to the state Title V. But the purpose of the meeting in September is to talk about this and consider some amendments to that, because people like Hillary, health agents who are permitting systems, right now there's no requirement on part of Title V to put in anything but any standard Title V system. Now, as I think you all know, towns have the ability to write their own regulations to require more stringent standards, and I think Wellfleet's been doing some of that. But this would be a change statewide in the state law, which would make it even stronger. You can also see down here effluent meeting 10 milligrams per liter. So that's the goal. And I just want to advise you, and I've offered to Hillary, in fact, this is one of the things we're going to talk about next week, I think, to get her thoughts on how this might get amended. I'm going to prepare some comments on my own behalf about what I think should happen here. But I wanted to reach out to the town to, first of all, let you know this is happening. And secondly, if any of you have specific ideas on what this should be, I'm happy to be your representative at that advisory committee meeting. I think it's an opportunity to provide backing to health departments who are issuing septic permits to make sure they're consistent with receiving waters. And now that you have a finished MEP study, I believe that it will qualify as one of these so-called nitrogen-sensitive embayments.
So Scott, could a town map their own nitrogen-sensitive embayments and say,
Well, you
based
know,
on based on best data, and then we could just simply say, well, then you have to put in these septic systems, and then we could even go one step forward and said, and we will, and we as a town will assist you in paying for those.
absolutely. You can do that, and you do it through a local health regulation. You can't, we actually had a test case in Dennis. I was doing a project in the town of Dennis, and we tried to make a case to the Board of Health that their embayment, which was also an MEP embayment, was in fact a nitrogen-sensitive embayment, and the town could declare it so. And they decided against that because the wording here in the Title V says DEP has to do the designation. But your question is, can the town do it on their own? And the answer is absolutely. Chapter 111, Section 31 empowers boards of health to write your own regulations. And that's an option that we could consider here as part of the wastewater committee, a local regulation that would require these. And then, as you suggested, maybe some municipal funding to support some of this transition. You may recall that I showed a slide at, I think, the last meeting. Hillary provided me some really interesting data on the number of upgrades, repairs in the town. And I projected that out over, I think, a 20-year period. And it adds up pretty quick. So one really nice way, I think, to consider doing this transition, instead of knocking on people's doors and saying, you got to do this, would be when they come to the town for an upgrade permit or repair or real estate transaction. At that point, say, then you have to upgrade. And if you provide some funding to that, even better. It strikes me that that would be a really efficient way to do this, and one that might be politically, saleable. So yeah, that's absolutely.
Can I ask a question? This is Hillary. I'm sorry.
Hillary, how are you?
Just jump in. I'm good. I'm sorry to jump in. I know you're all on Zoom, but I'm on the phone, so I don't know how to raise my hand. So excuse my ignorance. I'm curious. I have a couple things. I'm curious about the funding stream that we could help folks pay for this. That's question one. And question two is, I think the Board of Health at this moment would welcome the opportunity to hear from the Wastewater Committee with recommendations for new regulations, because I know we're eager to jump on the cesspool upgrade, and the sooner I think we get these regulations in place, we set a start time, then the quicker we can move ahead, knowing that this will have an impact moving into the future. So I think the board is ready to hear that kind of commentary from you, and when we look to do housing regulations, we open up a whole public hearing process, and so that would be a good time to kind of do it all in one fell swoop. So I'm going to go back on mute, and those are my two comments at this moment.
And Hillary, while I have you, I mentioned earlier that you and I have a call scheduled next week, I think, to talk about some of this. So if that's still available, I'll show you these slides. I know you can't see them while you're driving.
Perfect. That's
and
perfect.
I've got the nitrogen sensitive area wording up here in Title V. And the other thing is I'm willing to help the town draft the health regulation to effectuate this if in fact the committee wants to go in that direction.
No, I think it's great. And then just as a point of information for those who might not know, the Board of Health does require alternative systems within 100 feet of a marine resource or a drinking water well. And so we do have that regulation on the books, and that's been on there for a really long time.
Within 100 feet of a marine area, you said, Hillary? What was it?
Yeah, within 100 feet, and I think ideally, I'd like to go 300 feet from any wetland resource. So I just throw that out there for consideration.
Okay. Yeah, we can certainly
Yeah.
talk about that.
So, Scott, this is Fred, and
Yep.
for Hillary's benefit, we had this discussion several meetings ago. We basically said, okay, is if we took a look, and I think we said we determined that there was something like 65 to 70 new or newer replacement systems put in Wellfleet on an annual basis, and if it costs $10,000 additional per system to make it one of these enhanced systems, that was for easy math, that was $700,000 a year. Okay, that if the town said we'll pony up the extra money, you're going to have to put in this new septic system anyway, and we'll pony up the extra money. And then when we examine that as compared to having to store the entire town, that was a huge cost benefit. In other words, if we did this every year, if we took out a mortgage for, I don't know, $50-100 million for to store the entire town, or we amortize that over 30 years or whatever, 50 years, and then we had to do this, or we just simply ponied up $700,000 a year for enhanced systems all over towns, and maybe and then also put in things like that oil pumping oil into the ground as a
PRB. Yeah.
Reactive area.
permanent reactive barrier. That the combination of those two things would still be drastically cheaper to the town and would meet the requirements, gradually, but we would be headed in the right direction as part of our overall plan to reduce the nitrogen load in the abatement area.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Hillary, I think your question about what's the revenue stream is an important one. As we get going today, Courtney we were talking a little bit about Maria, the new town manager, joining you. And we thought that maybe after she gets her feet on the ground, that maybe a small group of us could meet with her, probably still virtually, to brief her on the plan that we're talking about. And this would be obviously a good subject to consider, because part of it's going to be a financial commitment on part of the town, and not an insignificant one, but I agree with you, it's probably a lot more cost effective than some of the alternatives.
Just looking at rough round numbers, Scott, and Hillary, we should be getting around 500 to 700,000 from the Airbnb tax. I know everybody's been spending that 3 or 4 times over, but initially that was the idea was that would be used for for wastewater. Even if the town provided a 50% credit, so not the full 10,000 incremental cost, but even 5, that would drop it down to about 350,000. One would think that there ought to be a way to earmark that and designate at least something as a program, given the efficiency, efficacy, and cost benefit. And if there's some program like that, also other homeowners who aren't in a resale situation or a required upgrade, if they were to take advantage of it too, it may also help accelerate the process. So that's just an observation that we might be able to work on, especially with our new town manager. The other thing is, since we have a designated area of critical concern, would that qualify as a DEP designated nitrogen sensitive embayment? I
don't think so. I don't think that qualifies unless that becomes the regulatory change. But I know that there are ACEC has been established for all kinds of different reasons other than nitrogen. So I tend to doubt they'd put that in there as kind of a straight change across the board. But I do think, it strikes me, one of the recommendations I intend to make, unless the town tells me not to do this, because I don't want to recommend something that's not helpful to the town, would be to suggest that all the MEP mapped watersheds that have shown, to be systems that are over the threshold strike me as a pretty good definition of a nitrogen sensitive embayment. And that would certainly qualify Wellfleet.
Right. Well, in DEP, it
Art?
would seem, go ahead, John.
Yeah, before we get away from the subsidizing upgrades, I'm perfectly comfortable for subsidizing someone who wants to upgrade on their own. That is, they feel they want to reduce the nitrogen upload in the bay and are willing to change their system to help that. That subsidy makes sense. I'm less comfortable with subsidizing someone who plans to sell their home, has to upgrade their system anyway, and wants the town to basically subsidize the sale of their home so that they can walk off, somewhere else. Or they want to build an extension on their home. We don't subsidize someone to bring their house up to code if they want to sell their house or build an extension. So I'm not that comfortable with subsidizing people who are doing this because they have to. The town needs to reduce the nitrogen, and I think that's what we should do. And if we're going to subsidize anyone, let's subsidize people who are saying, look, we've got a Title V system. We don't like the fact we're overloading a system. We'll voluntarily upgrade our system to an alternative IA system. Great, let's subsidize those people. But I'm not so keen on subsidizing people who are selling their home to, for their, personal enhancement, financial enhancement.
Yeah, I hear you, John, and I would ordinarily agree. But in this case, they're not required to go to this enhanced IA.
But we can make them, we can say, if you are selling your home or if you're doing an upgrade, you now have to do that. The same way we say, if you're going to build an extension on your home, you have to upgrade your electric system to meet code. I mean, that's standard practice for the building code. And I think the town will move to a higher standard, especially within 300 feet of a wetland. The question is, does the town subsidize the people who are upgrading their system? Not when they have to, but, I'm willing to subsidize people who don't have to upgrade their system. I think we need to increase our standard, and I don't think we need to subsidize people to meet that higher standard who want to sell their home or want to change a normal 3-bedroom house to a 10-bedroom house. I'm not up for subsidizing those people, not with town money. That's
maybe there's some variable subsidy options depending on what the trigger is that we could build into the regulations.
Yeah, let's put that on for, I think that's a big discussion, so.
Right, and I have to go off anyway, so
Yeah.
I wanted that in there before I left.
Sure.
Sorry.
Should I keep going, Kurt, just to get through this?
Yep. Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. So I just put 95 Lawrence on here because it's on the agenda. Hillary, I don't know if you're still on the phone, but I guess the point here is, does anybody know if the town has finalized the contract with the engineering firm? I think it was Bowler Engineering or something like that. And is that off and running? And my suggestion, and Hillary, we may talk about this next week, was to help coordinate.
Yeah. I can touch base on this. We did execute a contract with Bowler. They're working with another outfit for engineering, and we released another sort of RFP that I gave a look at for the IA treatment companies to weigh in on what they would provide at this location. So that's all in the works.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay, well, I just want to get a quick update on that because I think this is still on our agenda, and I'll certainly offer to help work with them in any way I can help because I think it's an interesting opportunity. So nothing more on that. These are just the calculations I provided before as options to be considered there. So I think that's underway. Unless anybody has anything else on that, we can keep going here.
No, but that also is another one where, we'd want to talk about, whether that would, whether we would want to consider a subsidy for the enhanced system.
Right. My sense is that there are some pretty good opportunities there to help out the Duck Creek situation, as I tried to pitch before. This is every time I sit down and try to balance this nitrogen budget, Duck Creek's one of my biggest headaches. It's a tough one to solve. And the fact that this project is in that watershed makes it hard for me to not think about as an opportunity. So, but again, we'll help if we can. The next thing I have on the agenda is the PRB. And as you recall, this was either a trench method, as this picture shows, or the injection method that we had talked about. And this is, I think I showed you this picture. This is the Wacoit Bay and Falmouth system that went in, I think 15 years ago, still working pretty well. Pretty good, very good removal rates, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the watershed MVP mapping. Over here, this dense area of high septic loading, nitrogen loading was the focus. Here's a close-up of it. The idea was to try to look at putting something along Commercial Street. There's the photo of the intersection. I have obtained the plans where the stormwater system was put in the ground there. And I think there's an opportunity to maybe do a pilot project here. This is something I wanted to, my last slide is kind of a summary of next steps, and I put on here as a question. We can come back to it. Is the town interested in proceeding with some sort of a pilot? And one of the thoughts is how to do that. My first suggestion might be to put in a well or a couple wells to determine depth of where the nitrogen is. These are from the Barnstable study. As you can see, this is the depth from 0 feet to 80 feet below the water table, or the land surface. The water table is shown here. And this, I'm colorblind. Is that a red line?
Green, yeah.
Green. See, I knew I'd get it wrong. That green line is the nitrogen concentration. So you can see in this first well at Bay Street, they found, and the concentrations are down here. So 6, 8, 10 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. That's really high at the shallow area. And then you can see some of these other wells, like this one over here. The nitrogen profile kind of does that as you go down. So this is what we'd want. This would be what I think would be a next step if the town wants to do any kind of investigation along that Commercial Street, would be to find out where, what the nitrogen levels are at, because that would help us decide, can we do this as a trench method? How deep do we have to go if we do injection wells? I'm optimistically thinking it may be pretty shallow, which would make it a lot more cost effective. But if the town wants to proceed with something along those lines, that would be a good first step. In terms of a multi-level, these are, as you go down here, each one of these dots represents a sampling point in the multi-level well. So you'd want to take a sample every, let's say, 5 feet or so going down. In the case of Commercial Street, I don't think you'd get down 80 feet because I think you'd hit salt groundwater. My guess is that whole groundwater system there is only maybe 20 or 30 feet thick. So it wouldn't be that involved to do it. And I think that'll be really valuable information to help decide whether or not this looks like a good site for PRB or not. We'd also be able to get what is the concentration of nitrogen in there. I know we have samples from private wells throughout the area that suggest it's pretty high, 2, 3, 4, 5 milligrams per liter, but it would be nice to have a vertical profile like this. So I just wanted to show you this as an example of what might be a good step in that direction.
What's the cost?
The cost? Actually, we're installing some more of these wells in Barnstable right now. I mentioned earlier as part of that septic system study. So I can get you, Desmond Well Drilling is the company that's doing it under contract with USGS. And I'll actually get you the cost, because what they're doing is they're actually going to put these multi-level wells in, which is obviously more expensive than putting in just a single well. I mean, a 30-foot well you can put in for like $1,000 or $2,000, but my guess is this is probably more like a $10,000 installation with all these sampling points. But I can get you that cost. Okay. And I've just got 2 more slides here, and we can kind of head back and talk about. All I did here is this is the table I showed you last time with each watershed. This is my this is what I work with to try to keep solving this issue using different options. And what I've done is I put the Mayo Creek number 317 in here, and what that did is it reduced the number of INAs that were required up here. It was 100% replacement in that sub-watershed, so it knocked it down a little bit. It's still a high number, which is why I have it bolded here, meaning to meet, according to the MEP study, even with the Mayo Creek project and some aquaculture shellfish, we still need to install or renovate a lot of the majority of the septics in that watershed. This is in the watershed, the sub-watershed is called the Cove, which is just downstream of Duck Creek, okay, right where the town pier is. And I think this is what Mayo Creek flows into. So that triggers, the reason I want to put this out here is the big variable in this plan, the way I see it, well, two of them. One is, do we want to pursue this enhanced INA thing? And my sense is we do. But the other one is the aquaculture shellfish, which is a big variable here. We can, according to the DEP credit numbers, we can get some pretty good numbers here. But this has been a bit of a moving target in terms of what I put in this plan. How many oysters, how many acres of oysters, and Kurt and I have talked a little bit about this more. And I know it's there's a lot of different opinions on this. So my question to the committee would be, at some point we got to figure out how we are going to try to get some cohesive answers to that question. I think Nancy Savetta ought to be part of that discussion, as well as probably others. But I just wanted to put that out there, kind of an update on the calculator, or how I'm trying to solve all these required nitrogen reductions. And that is a variable that I'm going to need to get some more feedback on at some point. And then the last slide I have is this one, and this is where I'll stop. Next steps, what can I help with? What else can the town do to move this along? And I already mentioned the PRB project to think about. I already mentioned Mayo Creek. I'm happy to work with John and others on that. We can have an offline conversation and see if there's a way to take that project the next step. I've already mentioned working with 95 Lawrence people. We already hit the subject of the local regulations. I had put it on the agenda here, so I'll talk with Hillary about that, I guess, is the best next step. And again, happy to work with any of you that have ideas on what the regs ought to say. I'll just mention I've written a lot of local health codes, and the good news is the guidance, parameters, enabling legislation is extremely broad. So we can do a lot of things there. I've actually been an expert witness on a number of court cases where people have challenged local health regulations, and I've never seen them overturned in my experience. So a lot of opportunity there. So that's kind of what I had. I'll stop there. I know there's a lot of people with tight time schedules here. So Kurt, where do you want to go next?
Just from a committee perspective, why don't we just look at the regulation thing? Maybe that's something we can deal with pretty quickly. The Board of Health would obviously have to write those regulations. Is there anybody on the committee that doesn't think that's a good idea?
I think it's like, it's probably one of the best ideas because it's long-term, it's cumulative, it will consistently year after year reduce the nitration load. And if we can make it palatable by putting in tax money or finding other money, marking money, I can't see anything but a win-win.
I agree.
So I guess the next step there would be, as a committee, we'll talk about subsidy and how I would see that more as our role in trying to figure out how to fund something like that and to what extent it should be funded. Because the Board of Health certainly wouldn't, I don't think, get into that. And I guess, Hillary, it sounds like, from our standpoint, whatever we can do to help, if Scott's engaged in crafting the regulations, we don't really have to be involved. We'd simply, have that as an item. We'd have some nitrogen credit around it. And then the committee would work on some funding if we can find it. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Hillary? Any thoughts if you're still there?
I'll follow up with her next week, Kurt,
Okay.
on that call.
Sorry, I'm here. I hear it. I'm driving in the car. My kid just threw up everywhere. Yes, it makes perfect sense. So add vomit to COVID and wastewater, and I'm really doing well today.
No.
It's good that you're still laughing, Hillary.
I hear you all, and it makes perfect sense. And I'm going back on mute because we just pulled into a fire station parking lot to mitigate the situation here.
Oh, no. Okay, terrific. So the next thing would be, just from a committee standpoint, again, how does everybody feel about pursuing a PRB pilot?
I think that's a no-brainer too, but I think Scott's kind of like, crawl, walk, run idea, where we basically let's take some testing to see where they would work best, right? Drill those wells, take some measurements, see where we will get the most, the pilot would work best, or would provide us with the most information as it was valuable or not, is definitely the start of that pilot. But I think a PRB pilot I could see in the end just like running a trench down Commercial Street from stem to stern, and filling it with oils or chips, and just saying, and we could easily test what was coming, how much, that reduced the nitrogen load, if it did at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you were right, Scott. The lens is probably pretty narrow there, like, maybe 30 feet.
Yep.
We also have data, by the way. Amy, I think Amy collected it. There's a 30-foot well and a 10-foot well sampling point at the condos across from the town pier. So as part of the Oyster Project water quality monitoring, she did groundwater monitoring as well. And so we did have a 30-foot and a 10-foot sample location, and she's got data there as well.
Okay.
Which will give you a sense.
Yep.
It's not exactly the location that you're thinking about, but it might be indicative of what's coming out for groundwater.
Sure. Okay.
And then this is Nancy. I just wanted to say, when we start to go down the road, it doesn't seem like it's on the first next steps here that you've outlined, but when you get down to the shellfish piece of it, of course, I'd welcome sitting down with everybody, and probably Scott, I wouldn't mind just like you and I connecting beforehand so that I make sure I'm really understanding, because we've gone back and forth, and I know I haven't really had the just the comfort level to dive into any sort of project or analysis yet, or even brainstorming. So if maybe you and I could connect first, and then we have a greater meeting. I know it's not on the immediate next steps, but I'm just making sure that, I volunteer my time to tap in when it becomes necessary, or when you reach that.
Yeah, no, actually, I'm glad you said that, Nancy. It really should be on here. I mentioned it during I don't know how long you've been on the call, but I did mention it a few minutes ago, and it should be on here. So I apologize for that. But why don't
I saw it on there, but I just, I saw it. I've been on for most of the call.
Okay.
But I just thought, it's not the most important next step. But when you get there, definitely connect.
Okay. Well, why don't I'll contact you to schedule another call, a follow-up call, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank
All
you.
right. I will do that.
It's a very important piece.
It is.
It's a piece with a big question mark.
Yeah. The other thing that I was, noticing, Scott, too, from your numbers there, especially because of the Duck Creek, Mayo Creek, challenge that we have.
Right.
The other thought that I had, Nancy, was just in terms of, enhanced shellfish there, near and around after the dredging, near and around the pier, given the data that we had from the original project and the nitrogen removal level there, something in that neck of the woods makes a lot of sense because of, the challenge of Duck Creek and Mayo Creek, but also the level to which it would help reduce re-infiltration of the dredged, mooring basin and channel areas. So there's like wins that could potentially come out from something like that. And
Yeah, as long as we operate under the, awareness that it's not like we can't create a reef back there in perpetuity. We would have to perhaps, build something up, let it work for, let it do its thing for 3 years, open it up and start somewhere else. Or maybe we, let it do its thing for 3 years, and a year or so after, like we might have to rotate areas, but I'm not comfortable closing off an area that is a wintertime, prime fishing ground, like forever, to create a sanctuary. But I am willing to explore, different ways that we could do rotational closures that would help, obviously, it would serve multi-purposes.
Yeah, and what I was thinking too is that with what DMF was talking about as far as the area around the pier, where your candy cane is now, in front of the condos.
Yes.
Like for example, if that candy cane was at the point, you could at least have that area in and around from the condos around to the pier and around the other side, which is has to be closed anyway for.
Well, that's true. I wonder, the only thing I wonder about is like, but when all the slips are in the summer, so we'd have to be really strategic about how we placed it.
Yeah, but that was where that's where I saw an opportunity, because it has to be closed anyway, so it's really not as much of an impact. And then the rotational closures, in other words, if we started out with something that we can basically all agree makes some sense, look at that and see what the order of magnitude is. We might be a lot further along in getting to Scott's numbers than we actually realize. And then rotational closures or other methods or in other locations and places, we'd have to look at that to the extent that, we still need more. But it's, at least to put something on the table that looks like it, isn't going to, cause a huge uproar. The other thing, Nancy, I've been trying to get from DEP, and Scott and I have talked about this a little bit, is credit for, in other words, so that the industry doesn't feel like what the town is doing is going to compete in any way, shape, or form with any kind of commercial shellfishing or aquaculture. We do need to get DEP to agree that you can leave an oyster in the water and still get credit.
Yeah, and the other thing is that, and we did a little bit of this, Scott, on the other project on our MIPA permit for culching, but looking and quantifying, the amount of oysters that are being taken out of the harbor every year for the town, and looking at that big picture over time even, because from a county study, it looks like kind of that the most nitrogen is taken up by young oysters growing. And so once they hit 3 inches, then it's almost like the nitrogen mitigation that they provide, it stabilizes or gets a little lower, whereas a growing oyster, so let's just call it, between a petite or all the way up to a petite and then a 3-inch legal oyster in the wild, you've got a lot of uptake. And if we could figure out maybe some different calculations, and we could work with Josh over at the county, because he's the one who did that and found that the smaller oysters are actually taking up more. And then if those oysters are coming off and getting sold as petites and 3 inches from grants, it'd be interesting to just, we haven't quite calculated the nitrogen removal being provided by aquaculture and wild harvest. And I think that's what I would like to try and do as our starting point. And then, so if this is what's happening more or less year in, year out, then what do we need to do in addition? And that might, instead of just like diving into additions, let's look what the harbor is providing already, especially when you're looking at the growth of smaller oysters getting larger. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think you're right, Nancy. I don't think Wellfleet is properly characterized because of the the rate of uptake of small oysters, especially on grants.
Because why?
But it also,
In other words, it's underestimate what Wellfleet's actually removing from oysters is underestimated because aquaculture is primarily dealing with very small up to petites, and we are removing a lot more nitrogen probably than we're getting credit for.
Yeah, so maybe that's kind of a path we can start exploring.
Yeah.
But the other thing is go into the rotating sanctuary concept. I think that's a great idea, just simply because it becomes predictable. You can kind of say, okay, this is a sanctuary, small. We're going to grow up to petites. Now we're moving the sanctuary over here, and we're going to harvest, if we can, that previous sanctuary, and and then start growing again. I think that's a predictable way of doing things.
Yeah, and what that just made me think of? What about the prohibited area on the other side of Uncle Tim's Bridge? The north, or what is it, east side of Uncle Tim's Bridge. That whole area is prohibited. And that would be, if you think about it, you've got everything from the mobile station and, all those houses along to Uncle Tim's Bridge. And you have, some of the Cannon Hill, Pine Point places.
Oh, you're right, Nancy, and there's a lot of load. There's a lot of load in that area, so it's a great location.
Yeah.
Hey, Nancy, I'd love to talk to you more about that because we had a conversation like that, again, here in Barnstable. As a non-shellfish person, it strikes me that there is a great opportunity to do some attenuation using closed areas. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think the state changed their rules on that in the last year or two, meaning they will allow it if it's, I forget the term, but it has to be heavily restricted and monitored and policed to make sure nobody poaches.
Yeah, yeah. And there was something about, like, I remember learning about it last year in our constable class, shellfish gardening. And they were letting people set up like shellfish gardens, but I didn't. Then DMF was not looking kindly on that. Like they felt it was a little too difficult to manage. But I think that Duck Creek being so exposed, under. We drive up and down Commercial Street a million times a day. So
it'd be easy to police it.
It's an easy place for us. It's not like you don't have to even go. And so with the pier, that would be good too. But then I think also about the Herring River, and that's a little bit more difficult to patrol because you have to actually go all the way out there.
Yeah. So I think what we should do though, Nancy, to put to move the ball forward a little bit is, I do think it's a great idea. Maybe Scott, you and I sit down and kind of look at some of those options and what's viable, what's not viable, and then get our hands around order of magnitude in terms of what that actually means for the sensitive areas. The other thing in the DMF guidelines is if whatever's being done for a public purpose, as long as the public purpose is continuing to be served, you do have more latitude in terms of what when you have to, or whether you decide to open it or not.
Well, the nice thing about that approach, I think, is it doesn't, as somebody said earlier, it doesn't compete with the commercial guys, right? If we're growing shellfish for that purpose, it's being policed, so there's no public health hazard, and there's nothing new coming into the market. It's kind of a win-win situation. That area you're talking about, Nancy, that would really help me sleep better at night if I could come up with a good solution for Duck Creek, because it's really a tough one.
Yeah, and I feel like I've had this idea before, and maybe Johnny mentioned something, and it wouldn't work. So let me check with him too.
Who is this?
The mention of a prohibited area around the marina makes me think about Duck Creek too.
Yep.
And again, then you're right; it's not competing.
Right.
And you have spawning that's happening, which would be great.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about that, Nancy. Who are you referring to? John? Somebody?
John, the assistant constable for propagation, John Mankiewicz.
Oh, okay.
He's the one who really, he should be in on all of our conversations because he's got 35 years in the industry and he really understands things.
He's in
Much better than me.
Okay.
So as far as the next steps, just getting back to this, because I'm running out of time here.
Yep.
Yep.
So we're all basically saying the enhanced IA septic and the PRB pilot project is an excellent thing. Obviously, Mayo Creek restoration, we got to do some evaluation there. 95 Lawrence Road, that new, I guess is that going to be low cost housing up there?
Right.
Yeah. So obviously putting in a that would be a great place to put in some enhanced septic systems. The only other thing I wanted to bring to everybody's thought is that we had those sub-abatement areas that Ryan brought up, right? That might be a good place for a pilot program, kind of like what they did in Barnstable. He came up on one of these meetings. He showed us all these sub-abatement areas around.
Yep. Potential restoration projects, right?
Yeah, I think that's what they were.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and I was like thinking, well, after you showed us that Barnstable, pilot program, I'm like, well, that would be another, ideal kind of thing to do as a next step. Is like let's see if we can't get a pilot around one of these little areas where we can really show how. I mean, it sounds to me the reason that they're doing this pilot program because it can show very quickly the ability for these enhanced systems to produce a lower amount of nitrogen because the small nature of these abatement areas.
Yeah. The one thing I think, Fred, that we want to keep in mind as far as priority goes, though, is getting Scott to sleep more soundly at night because we've dealt with, the Duck Creek area or the areas where we've got really, really significant problems. So to the extent that our programmatic focus is on those areas, we do a couple of things. One is we get faster compliance, but the other is some of those areas are also part of the Black Mayo problem. So the quicker we start to address excess nutrient accumulation in those areas, the more benefit we're potentially going to be providing for the rest of the shellfish industry too, and for dredging and those things. So there's things beyond just pure nitrogen management that we get out of those as well. I think those are great. I agree with you, Fred, as far as pursuing those. The question in my mind would be whether we get more bang by doing any of those than we're going to get from a PRB pilot on commercial. In other words, do we need to demonstrate beyond Commercial Street that we should do those other locations as well? Because I think ultimately we should be doing those other locations, but the question is timing, I think.
Perfectly agree. And like I said, I think the enhanced. If I was to rate, most, the highest, the PRB pilot project and the enhanced AI systems would be the top of the list, and the shellfish aquaculture plan would be on the top of the list right there. To get the most bang for the buck. I don't know if everybody else agrees, but those would be. I mean, and I don't know which one would be which one of those three would be the top, but they're all very valuable.
Richard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Generally, I agree with everything that's been said. I think the one that's most intriguing is the shellfish because it's such a big question mark. And it's the one that seems to be most in doubt. And doubt may be the wrong word, but when Scott puts up his little projection, his spreadsheet, that's the one where he's most at the sort of mercy of the town. What is the number that can be put in there? And everything else seems to be pretty hard numbers. So that's the one that I think we need to figure out. And I would urge Nancy to get together with Scott and try to figure out what can be done, and for you too to get involved to see how to try to flesh that out and try to get as good a number as we can.
Okay.
Hey, everybody, I got to jump off to my next meeting. I have to go to work.
Is it a long walk? Long commute?
It's not a long computer. I just slide over here to this other computer.
So I agree.
It's just this little thing called COVID-19 and the fact that I work for FEMA that keeps me busy, very busy these days.
Yeah, we've reached about just 12:30, and I think what we should do is the other items that are still outstanding here is some discussion of public outreach, new board members and minutes, which we'll put as items for our next agenda, and then follow up on these next steps, and then getting some confirmation on the GHD contract for our next meeting. What would be a good time for our next meeting?
I gotta go, guys. I'm gonna run. Okay, bye.
All right. Well,
Thanks, Fred.
email your suggestion. Is that a motion to adjourn?
Motion to
Anything
adjourn.
else after you leave, Fred? We're done.
Okay,
How about another,
I'm on board with whatever you guys say.
Okay.
do another doodle calendar?
All right. We'll do that. That's a motion to adjourn.
Good. Seconded.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll
Thank
stay-
you, Nancy and John, for joining us today. That was very helpful.
Good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Talk to you
Thank
soon.
you, everybody.
Bye.
Here.